Welcome to this edition of Security and Compliance Weekly. We are joined today by Jim McKee, who's founder and CEO of Red Sky Alliance. Jim is going to guide us through an in-depth discussion of the Sunburst SolarWinds hack because, well, it's our turn to talk about it SCW style. Our first segment is going to be dedicated to going down the rabbit hole, and we'll cover such things as the ins and outs of the attack, who done it, maybe attribution, all that kind of stuff. We'll get all our feels out, and then in the second segment, we'll talk about what can we do about it, both personally, professionally, and even possibly as a nation. Jim's committed to staying on both segments, and he's even planning, and we've got him all set up on Discord to join us for the after party. So join us as we continue our journey of tearing down silos and building bridges on Security and Compliance Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. And now, it's the show that bridges the requirements of regulations, compliance, and privacy with those of security. Your trusted source for complying with various mandates, building effective programs, and current compliance news. It's time for Security and Compliance Weekly. The average cost to respond to an insider threat is $11.45 million. That's a lot of reasons why a functional insider threat program must be a core part of any modern cybersecurity strategy. To protect your organization's sensitive data and meet compliance requirements, you need controls in place to deter, detect, and disrupt insider threats. With ECRAN system, you can meet control requirements imposed by compliance mandates all within one insider threat management platform. Get your free 30-day trial at securityweekly.com/ECRAN. That's EKRAN, and fulfill your compliance requirements.
Welcome to episode number 58 of Security and Compliance Weekly, recorded on January 12th, 2021. I'm your host, Mr. Jeff Mann, and joining me today are my illustrious co-hosts, Scott Lyons, Josh Marpet, and we're going to officially introduce, as a co-host today, Mr. Liam Downward. Gentlemen, welcome. Even though he is a snowflake. Hey, if you missed Security Weekly Unlocked, you can now access all of the content on demand, whether you registered before the live event or not. Do this by visiting securityweekly.com/unlocked, and you either click the registration button or the login button. You figure out which one is appropriate. Also, learn how to conquer cloud complexity in our first Security Weekly webcast of 2021. This is going to be on January 28th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. You can register at securityweekly.com/webcast. And as always, you can go back to securityweekly.com/on-demand and peruse our vast portfolio of previous webcasts and technical trainings. All right. That's enough of that. On to the show. We have been wanting to take a stab at the whole Sunburst SolarWinds discussion. Of course, this broke back in December, and then we all went off on a holiday break, and it's been discussed some on some of the other shows, but we thought we'd take our turn at it. And at Liam's urging, we were able to arrange for Jim McKee to join us today. I met Jim on a prep call yesterday, and to be fully candid, I'm going to have a tough time not talking about PCI because I found out that he's a pioneer in terms of online payments processing. He's been doing involved in the PCI thing even longer than I have. But we will stick to the topic as best as we can. Jim, welcome to Security and Compliance Weekly.
Jeff, thank you for the invitation. I'm always happy to join an august group like this and talk about things that are going to be affecting all of us. This was a real surprise, and there's really no good answers yet. When I was first invited to do this, I thought, well, this will be a very short interview. No one knows who did it, and no one knows how they did it. So we're just going to sit here and talk about current events. But since go ahead, sir.
Well, I was going to say before we jump into that, I was going to ask if you could just sort of introduce yourself a little bit. And Liam, feel free to jump in if you want to provide some color commentary. But who are you? Why are you here? Give us a little bit of a recounting of your journey that got you to be with us today.
Well, it's been a long journey. I was classified or named as one of the pioneers of e-commerce back in the 90s because myself and 4 friends developed the world's first enterprise payment server. And people say, well, so what? Well, so what was the fact that it also provided real-time credit card authorizations on the internet. And so besides being able to take interactive voice response, IVR, call center, point of sale, all these transactions simultaneously and multi-threaded, run it through a server, and being able to then negotiate the lowest possible discount rate from the credit card processors. And people said, well, what's the big deal with this? And I said, well, if you look at the discount rate of maybe 2.75 on every transaction that goes through, if you can take a point or 3/4 of a point off of that, it turns into a whole lot of savings for the merchant who's running these things through. But it was a great idea. My team, my 4 friends and I did very well. And then we met a gentleman by the name of Bill Gates. And he had just come out with his Site Server 3.0 product. And he wanted a payment engine included. And so he included ours on board. And the rest was pretty much history. And from the Palinx Corporation, moved into payment processing, built payment gateways, was a lot into ACHs and credit card transactions. And when the Digital Signature Act of 2000 passed, we found we were in a position to do all sorts of financial dealings online that had never been done before because of the Digital Signature Act. And so when we began causing the problems on the internet of transferring ACH transactions, money transactions, and credit cards, we realized we had to start doing something to protect the internet. And that's when we developed authentication, encryption services. And then I found myself in information security. It was kind of a twisted path, but the whole problem was as the internet grew and people were sending more personal, private, and financial information through the internet, we really had to take a look at how to protect it. So that's kind of how I got here. I'm the founder and CEO of Red Sky Alliance. It's a cyber threat intelligence company. We have, for the last 9 years, been harvesting cyber threat information from around the globe through our own sources and our own collections. And we provide services outbound where people can use our feeds or use our products and better protect themselves. And one of the things that made this call so important to me is the fact of the value of cyber threat intelligence. And you need to know who's poking around your servers or your networks before they break in. And the SolarWinds seems to be something that it came from the inside versus something, from the outside. And I'm sure the analysts are going to be talking about this for a long time. But the big thing here is when you have a provider of services that can touch 18,000 companies, and you have a problem inside that, the ramifications of this are truly global. We pulled our own sources and tried to figure out where we could go with this, and everything pointed to Russia. And we've been very heavy in following the bears and the APTs out of Russia for the last 9 years. And so when this came up, it was one of these things of, well, it's state-sponsored. This wasn't something that some hacker was trying to make, some ransomware Bitcoin. This was a state-sponsored to just take down an entire economy, if at all possible. I know that's kind of a long roundabout answer to your question, but that's how I got here. I came from e-commerce, went into payment processing, and then came out on the back end of a 25-year, how do we say, journey. And I'm smack dab in cyber threat intelligence.
Got you. Well, I appreciate that. And, so we're shifting into the discussion about Sunburst, SolarWinds. I guess we have to technically call it Sunburst because there's some unwritten rule that we have to have name for these things. And
marketing. It's marketing. Come on, get the marketing.
And the logo.
So much of all this is marketing. I haven't even seen the logo yet. I'm not going to look for it. But when I first heard about it, when we first heard about it, it was FireEye, and everybody was going around, snicker, FireEye. They're supposed to be a security company. And then very quickly, I think everybody's attitudes changed because they were like, oh, they've discovered something that's a whole lot bigger than what we first thought. And it wasn't just them. Kudos to them for finding it. Now let's focus our snickering and banter on SolarWinds, but even there, I think it's become much bigger, much of a bigger issue because I think people are starting to figure out, wow, yes, it was SolarWinds, but it could have really been anything, and maybe it has been more than just SolarWinds. And what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it will be the second segment. What I keep coming back to is, as I hear about it, is. And my caveat is I grew up in the DoD during a time that was called the Cold War, where we had a clearly defined enemy that was the Soviet Union, and most of the or much of the efforts that were going on at certain intelligence agencies and security agencies that I worked for was focused on that enemy, and it was during what we called the Cold War. And I keep thinking I kept thinking as I heard more and more about the SolarWinds thing is like, well, this is just good old fashioned espionage. This is just good old fashioned Cold War cat and mouse. They do something big, and then eventually we find out about it and mitigate it, and then we do something big to them until it lasts, until they slowly discover it, and that's just kind of the nature of the game. In fact, that's the essence of security, the way I learned it back in the DoD days. And I can think of so many examples that are similar. The one that immediately comes to mind, which is public, and that's one of the caveats that I wanted to have before I shared it with this audience, because I do like my freedom. Back in the mid 80s, I think, shortly after maybe late 80s, shortly after I started working at the National Security Agency, a spy ring was discovered, and it was called Walker Whitworth. I have my ways. And Walker, I forget his first name, Johnny maybe. I think it was Steve. But Walker was, I think, in the Navy or in the Coast Guard or something like that, or Navy Reserves, and he was basically selling the cipher keys, the encryption keys for U.S. crypto systems to the Soviets, and had been doing so for financial gain for a good 10 years, and nobody knew about it. Nobody detected it. I think Whitworth was like his son-in-law or something like that, and he was also involved in the whole the business aspect of things. And the way it was discovered was Walker was going through a divorce, and somehow in the divorce proceedings, his soon-to-be ex-wife wanted to make sure that she was going to get her fair share of what she knew was his financial resources. She ended up blowing the whistle on him, calling the FBI and reporting him. So, all the stories that have been going on around, SolarWinds, it's so embedded and entrenched. How can we ever, detect it? It's so devastating. It's potentially permeating everything. 18,000 companies, and how did it go undiscovered? which I think is a fair question, but I also think back to, but you've got people in history who were spies. They were committing espionage, they were committing treason, and they did it undetected for 10 years. That's the nature of espionage. So I see this much more of an espionage thing. I will shut up now and let all you guys have at it, because I've spoken enough.
Well, let me just ask that. Sorry, let me just ask a quick question. So, do you feel that it actually is a lot longer than what it has been for the time for this attack took place? It's been going on for a lot longer, or is it from the standpoint of they think it's been over 8 months or more that it's been in place, or do you think it's longer than that, and we're not going to find out the full amount of that information till years down the road to see how long they were infiltrated through this supply chain attack? Because I believe me personally, I think it might be longer than what they're saying right now and what we're reading that this is being in place.
I agree with you. I agree with you fully. When something comes up like this, you've got to remember that there was a whole lot of reconnaissance going on here and a whole lot of connecting with C2s. And to go back to Jeff and the espionage, this wasn't started lightly, and it's been going on, and there was no clue. Those of us that work in the dark web and trying to find, ransomware guys and malware developers and, ransomware as a service, I could talk about this a long time. I probably will in the next 30 minutes. But the whole point is this has been going on for quite a while. And to be able to say it started on a particular date is really unfair. You can't say it started at a particular time, because just to get this thing to work had to have been a plan over a long period of time. There is even thought in the web right now, and I'm not going to quote a source because I don't remember who it was, but the whole thing is they said some of the software could have been contracted through developers in the Ukraine. And if you had, basically Soviet satellite developers working on something, they may not have known what the final product was going to be, but they still could have put in a back door or done something so they could, revisit this again. And I keep looking at the old Mad Magazine picture of Spy versus Spy, Jeff, and each one of them has a bomb. And who's going to throw the bomb first? Well, the bomb's been thrown at us, but we really don't have the information to know who did it. And that's where the forensics are going to come in. And with all the false flags and proxy servers and everything around the world, it doesn't take very many hops to completely disappear. Sorry, Liam. Go jump back in.
No, that's good. Because I feel that there's a lot more to it than we really know what's actually happening, right? You look at FireEye, you look at Microsoft disclosed a couple of weeks back saying that their source code has been touched and was accessed. So does that mean then potentially new hacks could come out, or new techniques, or new malware, ransomware comes out? What else is going on that literally could change the course of our future over the next couple of months, couple of years? How far does this set us back from a cybersecurity standpoint around this, right? So,
well, Liam, the tools that they were able to, download or observe from FireEye, this is a really dangerous piece of intelligence here that the adversaries can have. If you can take apart the tool that someone is going to use to see if they can find you, you couldn't have a better defense than to sit there and reverse engineer the tools that they're going to look to trap you, and then engineer around that. So the dozen or 15 tools that FireEye lost, this is critical. And FireEye was, the A team. The Secret Service would always bring them in on the big breaches. And, those of us that shopped at Home Depot, or we shopped at Equifax. They all have our information there, and any one of you who ever had a security clearance, the Office of Personnel Management, our private information is out there. And if the next hacks that come through, the hacker has already field tested their hack with the forensic tools, they're going to even be harder to find.
I think it's very important to make a distinction between hacker versus adversary, right? If we're using the term hacker as in a bad connotation and somebody who doesn't understand the nuances between hacker versus defender versus adversary, right? Here's that. They're going to say, well, anytime you hear the term hacker, period, it's a bad thing, which is not the case, right? In dealing with the SolarWinds breach, the bigger problem that we're going to start seeing in the community is supply chain risk management.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
That's a blessing and a curse, in my own humble opinion, right? So on one hand, you're trying to extend your company's resources and extend your company's use of other resources, partnerships, programs, and whatnot. So how do you define a security maturity level for your business that encompasses the supply chain? With recent developments inside of compliance technologies like CMMC, it is starting to come to light that, hey, we do need to focus on the supply chain and the supply chain risk. With the modification of 171, 172, 853, a little bit of ISO sprinkled in there, right?
CMMC.
We get CMMC. So the real question is not, are we going to continue to see a proliferation of these attacks? The answer is yes. I think we can guess that. The real question is how are companies going about securing their supply chain to buffer against these types of attacks? One of the things that has not ever been addressed in any compliance regime across the board, Jim, and I think you'll back me up on this, is the fact that companies that have been breached are still allowed to obtain compliance, that are still allowed to do work under compliance rules and regs. If we took a hard-nosed stance from a federal level that said, if you have been breached, we know you've been breached. Not only do you have to follow the state's notifications, but the breached company also gets dealt with inside of the compliance regime. So if we're pushing companies to try to protect against the breach and protect against third-party supply chain attacks, how are we accurately accounting for the depth, breadth, and scope of attacks moving forward? This one was landmark and monumental in that SolarWinds is everywhere. A lot of companies use it for asset management and database management and being able to track things. And unfortunately, SolarWinds, to the best of my knowledge, and I want you guys to correct me here, had one file that had all of the usernames and passwords and admins and everything else, one file inside of a DLL that was reverse engineered off of an open FTP server, in my own humble opinion, and not of that of my company or anything like that. This was begging to happen.
It's a very good point. It's, we look at these things and say, okay, we have critical industries. We have critical contractors. You look at a company like Northrop, they've got 14,000 subcontractors. And that's everybody from General Electric that makes jet engines, all the way down to Moe, who makes a bent piece of metal, which hooks into the missile racks.
Framistam of the whatever, yeah.
Yeah, and it's every time a missile's fired, Moe's bracket drops off, and you have to buy another one. But what's Moe doing down there in the Quonset hut in Carlinville, Illinois? Well, he's got an old NT box that hasn't been supported in years, but he uses it for invoicing. Well, you look at the weak links and how do you get in and how do you move up? Well, SolarWinds cut out the middleman. You didn't need to break into Moe's. You just got into the motherlode. You got into the system that touched everything. And so from this standpoint, can we, and I don't want to get sued, this is a question, this isn't a statement. Can we trust any SolarWinds customers going forward? Big question mark. This isn't a statement. We have to take a look at this. And this is based on what you just said, Jeff. It's like when, we used to play out in the yard when we were little. You had to get out of jail free card. All right, well, that was good. You got out of jail. Well, all right, you can get captured again, and you need another get out of jail card. But how do we finally certify the companies that have had or part of a major breach and say that you're okay now? And don't get me wrong, we're dealing in big politics here too. You've got a producer of jet engines in somebody's congressional district, and they were part of this. They can't shut down that engine plant and put 5,000 people out of work or put the company out of business. This is kind of what we used to say in sales. Well, it's an art and a science. You've got to use judgment. And this is something that we're all going to be wrestling with going into the future. And I hope that some of the smart people we have on the phone here have an answer, because I don't.
Well, I think there's some larger, more macro level philosophical questions at play here. And this is not an exhaustive list probably, but the issue of who done it, attributing it to the Russians or the Chinese or the Koreans or the 600-pound teenager living in his mom's basement, whoever it was. Part of me is like, who cares? Now, in the private sector, when you're talking about publicly traded companies, or even private companies, who did the breach? I don't think it makes a whole bunch of difference. From a national security perspective, critical infrastructure perspective, from a national defense perspective, yeah, I can see why attribution is important for planning on the counterstrike, perhaps, but not much beyond that. Liam, you had asked the question early on about how long has it been going on. I still kind of ask, who cares? I mean, yeah, you want to know what the extent of the damage was, but it might be easier just to assume total compromise, because we've all been totally compromised because of OBM and Anthem and Equifax and all that already. There's other examples. Those are just two that jump out at me. And I think the larger philosophical question is, who cares? How do we nip this in the bud? How do we detect that it's happening? And not just this one specifically, which, by the way, that's sort of the nature of defense in general throughout history, is you think you're doing okay, and then you find out that somebody owns you in some way that you never thought of or never anticipated, or you didn't think largely enough. And so you figure out how to account for that and detect it and prevent it, hopefully moving on, and you keep going until the next thing comes along. Again, it's that cat and mouse Cold War back kind of mentality. And I know that's a discussion for the second segment, but I'm more interested not in the attribution and what's the extent of the damage as I am in the discussion we're going to have in the second segment of what do we do about it? How do we move on? How do we take this specific incident and leverage it to try to explain to people that security is a lot bigger, a lot bigger, more complex problem than any of the compliance and security regimens you've been following for the most part, any organization that's out there, probably the government included. Maybe it's time to rethink things. That's where I think there's philosophical questions to have and discussions to be had.
But how far is it going to set us back? All right, if you talk about the philosophical questions, how far? So if we said, let's take, all right, you look at FireEye, you look at SolarWinds, you look at Microsoft, you look at GE, how much of their technology has been touched, right? Are we going to trust it? You talk about, the path of these, the ripple effect of the supply chain, and Scott brought it up as, do we trust them? right? Do we trust Microsoft now with their software being touched? Do you trust FireEye? Do you trust SolarWinds? So how far is this putting us back from a cybersecurity standpoint? And so where do we put a stake in the ground? Where to begin taking a path forward from this? And and when do we take a stance to say lessons learned and actually do a postmortem address of this to say, okay, it may not have finished the whole excavation and the finding out what's going on and the research, but what can we do from this point on to say, okay, let's put a stake in the ground, because we can have as many conversations as we want, but if we're collectively together as a cybersecurity community, we got to take a stance to say, okay, what are we going to change? We may not be able to mitigate or remediate these type of issues again in the future, because Windows has their supply chain, every product has it. So are they in the same boat? Are they going to scramble? So what changes is it going to affect? Is it going to cost more money for cybersecurity? Are we going to look at more on the administrative aspect? Are we going to, hate to say this, put more money onto other types of solutions such as insurance? I hate to say that. So I know it's a bad word.
This might be your only co-host episode if you go down that one.
Because to be honest, I've had this conversation with other people, right? And nobody's ever everybody has their own different opinion. And I think together as a group, we either got to come together and say, okay, we got to take a stance. Are we really going to understand the level of compliance and regulatory compliance that you can't have one that fits one side and the other side gets away with it? So what do we do here to kind of move forward? And is there a single path, or is there multiple paths, and which one's the right one? Because every person has their own opinion, everybody has their own interpretation.
Ultimately, when you're dealing with this kind of stuff, there has to be a way to be able to come back from being thrown over the edge, or being able to say that you popped the parachute. A number of states have taken the stance of, if you get breached, you have to do a breach notification. What states and the Fed are not doing is saying, here's the minimum bar that you have to make to be able to show that you've done the due diligence for the remediation piece.
Post-breach, you mean?
Post-breach, yes. So earlier when I was saying we need to take this seriously on a much bigger level, realistically, the piece that I left out was, how do you dial everything back once the mitigative actions and tactics have been applied?
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, so I gotta jump in, because Scott, you raised a really good question.
Jump in, Josh.
But the problem is that the consequences aren't there. If you have an auto accident, let me sort of rephrase the discussion. If you have an auto accident, your insurance goes up because you're more likely to have another auto accident, right? If you have a breach, nobody knows if you're more likely to have another breach because the actuarial information isn't there. And we've talked about cyber insurance until I'm going to bleed from my flippin' ears here, okay? But we just don't have the information, the knowledge. But so with things like CMMC, the federal government is trying to create compliance with teeth. You must be this tall to ride, or you don't get to ride, have a nice day. Okay. But it's costing people, and people are complaining, oh my God, it costs me money. Well, it does, but we're working on that. There's ways to make it simpler. But there's
so excuse me, Josh. We're sort of sliding into our second segment topic, and I think we've gone 30 at least already. So let's take a quick break.
God, yes.
We'll come right back.
But I get it when we get back.
If I decide that that's appropriate, we'll see.
Yes, Daddy.
All right, we'll be right back.